Welcome to the third session of the series, South Asian Englishes Current Research Direction. This session introduces corpus linguistic methods with reference to postcolonial Englishes. It discusses the advantages and disadvantages of including spoken language corpora, put forth the idea of balanced and representative corpora, and offers a speculation on how research questions influence corpus design.
So I will give you a very selective overview of what kind of corpus linguistic research has been done, how it started, and we will need that information to come back. We will come back to that when we do actually our practical work. So when we look at corpus linguistic research, I would also like to engage you in the session. I would also like to give you some guiding questions for discussion. So these are the points which will come up in the course of this hour. And I'd like you to form an opinion about the following questions that we are going to raise, so that in the end perhaps we can also have a little discussion round like we had last time. So this slide will come up as the last slide again, don't worry. So the question is, we have in a linguistic corpus, we sometimes have only spoken or only written material, sometimes we have both. And the question would be, what are the advantages and disadvantages of including spoken language in corpora? Another question is, what does it mean to say of a corpus that it's balanced and or representative? What kind of corpora can claim to be balanced or representative? And finally, and that's perhaps a question for all of us, if you want to continue with this line of work, how does your research question influence your corpus design and vice versa? This may not, I hope, that at least we get a starting point to answering these questions right now, but I think in the course of today and including tomorrow, this will also become much clearer. Okay, so when we look at what is a linguistic corpus anyway, we could say the basic characteristics is that it is a collection of spoken and or written text. And you could say, well, on that point, then any library is a corpus, but it's not. So you see, from a modern perspective, we are also very much interested in that it's naturally occurring speech, not prefabricated. Novels would also qualify for inclusion in a corpus, but just as one part of it. So you could say they are artistic representations of language. As such, they are part of what a representative corpus might be, because this is one way of language that we experience, but we shouldn't take everything from novels. And of course, in modern times, we want it to be machine readable so that we can process it with modern software. And further, and that's the point, it should be representative, or we should try to make it representative. And the question is, what does that mean? We can easily construct a corpus, let's say, we can download the online edition of the Times of India, and then we have a newspaper corpus. That would not necessarily be representative. It's not representative because it's only one newspaper, it's only one genre, and I think the people who are writing in this corpus are not representative of the Indian population in general. So as such, it would not be representative. It would be a genre corpus, as we call that. So in order to be representative, we would try to include as many different kinds of speakers, men, women, younger, older, different social classes, and also as many kind of different genres, newspaper language, court records, classroom discussions. And of course, the more representative it becomes, or the higher your ideas about what representative should means are, the more difficult it is. And we will come back to that when I comment on the individual corpus compilation principles of the corpora we are looking at. Again, balanced is a similar question. I can easily go to the net and download the whole of Shakespeare. You go to Project Gutenberg, create your own Shakespeare corpus. Then this is not really balanced. It's just one person, one time. And so corpus linguistics in the modern sense with machine-readable text also started with the beginning of the availability of computers. And the first corpus in the modern sense was created in the 60s in the US. So, and this was called the Brown Corpus of American English because it was created at Brown University. So that was the first ever corpus. And they used to compile it on punch cards. I don't think that anybody has ever seen these. You have to go to a computer museum. So it was not like in a modern processing system, but on individual punch cards. And this corpus, this is from the corpus manual. This is a 1 million word corpus, or roughly 1 million words, of running text of edited English prose printed in the United States during the calendar year 1961. So in that sense, it was limited to printed texts at a specific time in the year 61 in the US. So you could say, in a sense, it made an attempt of being balanced. I show you in a second, but by modern standards, it's very restricted. Only written, printed language. It was released in 64, and it tried to be balanced and representative. It contained 500 text samples of 2,000 words each. And these were divided up into different categories, so at least to capture the range of the written language at the time. So there were two main categories. First of all, informative prose and imaginative prose. So these were the basic divisions. And within informative prose, these are just some examples. They had press editorials, press news, they had sports news, so different categories from or different subcategories from the category of press. They had, for example, biography or non-fiction counted into that. They had government documents. They had this category popular law. These were, for example, guidelines on cooking or gardening, something like that, and some more. And within the imaginative prose, they again had different genres like Western, science fiction, humorous text. And I'm just mentioning this Western, for example, because this corpus design was replicated on the corpus that you mentioned yesterday, the Corpora corpus. So this exact corpus design was matched onto writings from Indian English. And then, of course, there is not really a genre of Western in India, so they had to find a replacement for that. So you could say this was the first corpus available. And since this was a corpus of American English, the whole corpus design was replicated. And this is where it becomes interesting for us. Then we can study varieties. If we have one corpus design, we follow it with another variety, and then you can make direct comparisons. And this was replicated. And this was used then in a book by a dear colleague of mine, Christian Meyer. He wrote a whole book about this corpus and the following corpora. It's called 20th Century English, History, Variation and Standardization. And this is Christian Meyer from the University of Freiburg. And he based this book studying language change in the 20th century on this corpus, beginning with Brown, American English. Then the corpus was replicated in Britain. So we had two corpora in the 60s, and then the whole corpus design was replicated in the 90s. I show you how this looked like. So this was the original corpus, Brown, the one we just introduced. And this, as I said, this was about printed material in the 60s and American English. and then the whole corpus design was copied and recreated with British English, and LOB stands for Lancaster Oslo Bergen corpus of British English. And since the structure of these corpora is parallel, so we can justifiably claim if you find similarities and differences, then we have empirical backing for our findings. And this was in the 60s, and Christian Meyer at University of Freiburg in Germany oversaw a project of replicating them again in the 90s. So taking text from 1991, and then this was called Fraun rather than Brown, so to say this is the Freiburg update of Brown, and rather than Lob, it's called Flob, the Freiburg update of Lob. So we have 30 years difference. You could say we have a difference in time, and we have a difference between British English and American English. And Christian Meyer investigated all sorts of different aspects of grammar, of the lexicon. We have to keep in mind we're talking about the written language, so perhaps we wouldn't expect that many changes. We're talking about a highly standardized codified, or two highly standardized codified varieties of English, so you might not expect dramatic changes. And this is also where corpus linguistic comes in. We will probably not see sea changes in the development of English, but we will see small subtle changes in terms of preferences. And this is something we can measure in terms of quantification. So some ways of saying things will increase and some will decrease. And I've just, as I said, the book is a very wide-ranging one. I've just picked out some examples of what he investigated. One point is the passive. And this always strikes me because this makes me feel rather old. I can see language change happening in my lifetime. There's a passive called the get passive. Are you familiar with that? Because we would normally say, so the get passive, if I say, I got hit, rather than I was hit. I got hit by a car. That's the get passive. And when I learned English, the get passive implied some kind of agency. So when you say, I got hit by a car, it's somehow your own fault, rather than I was hit. I mean, you know, agent patient, when I say I was hit by the car, I'm the agent, I'm the victim. But when I say I got hit by a car, then it somehow implies it's my own fault. So there's a leftover of agency in that. And Christian Meyer investigated the frequency of that. And you see the frequency is on the increase. I mean, the actual figures, nobody has to keep them in mind, but the actual figures are quite drastic. So the get passive is on the increase even more in American English than it is in British English. And this is already an indication that it is losing this connotation of agency, that it's changing its meaning subtly. And I found one nice example. I really love this example. This is from the Fraun corpus. Calamari gets grilled and served with beans, garlics, and tomatoes. And I think you probably can't assume that it's the calamari's agency that got it onto the grill. So you see, when it says here loss of connotations, there's lost this meaning of agency that this is somehow your own fault. And in contexts like these, when a calamari, you know, doesn't really have a free will, I assume, is put on the grill, that this agency meaning is totally lost. So, and the be passive, there is a certain decrease. And so just by imagining or by examining these figures, by seeing what is on the increase and what is on the decrease, and then by finding the context where you can safely say this original meaning or the meaning connotation of agency is gone, then you can say, well, there's change in progress going on. It's not that one form is there, outing the other one all of a sudden. They both coexist, but the preferences of speakers change. And this is what you can see. This is change in progress under our very noses within a 30-year lifespan. Another example would be relative pronouns. I wonder whether some of you have been brought up to make a difference between who and whom in specific context. And I was told already that whom is considered very formal, nobody uses it anymore. But with a corpus, and we're talking about a written corpus, so written corpus would always be more formal than the spoken language, but with a corpus you can investigate. It's really who and whom is whom going out of the language. And the figures are as such. So in general, when you look at relative pronouns in general, which is decreasing, that is increasing. So you can see here which is decreasing in American English, and that is becoming more popular in American English. And the zero option, you can also say the person coming to dinner rather than saying the person who is or that is coming to dinner. The zero option, which is supposed to be more informal, more spoken language, is increasing in the written language. And whom is decreasing. So that means the context, and of course then I'm cutting short a very long story, so you have to search for all the contexts where whom could occur, and then measure it and compare it with who and zero option and so on and so on. So it takes a long time. But then you have empirical, verifiable evidence that whom is decreasing in British English, probably replaced by who, and this has become the more neutral form. So if your students fail to write whom rather than who, tell them they're just in the general trend. Another example, this is something what you would call language change from above. There's been a lot of discussion in many Western countries about non-sexist or gender-neutral language, and this concerns the so-called generic masculine form. So for example, when you make a call, you could say, everybody should bring his computer. That would be the generic form, masculine form, which is supposed to cover both men and women. But the discussion has been that we should have a gender-neutral language, so say his or her, or even their. And what this generic form, he, everybody should bring his computer, this has been massively decreasing, massively. So you could see this is a political reflex of discussions that have been brought about to change language to make it more gender neutral. And so these are always percentages, and then these are absolute figures. Remember, we are talking about a 1 million word corpus, so within a 1 million word corpus, the absolute figures, so this is too low to convert that into percentages, so this is just a tendency. So in absolute figures, there were 11 instances of he or she in British English in the 60s, but now there are 37. In American English, in the 60s, 9. In the 90s, 57. So there is a definite increase. And the singular form, they, everybody should bring their laptop or something like that, which you might consider wrong, because everybody can be considered a singular, or nobody should bring their laptop or something like that. But this form was absent in the 1960 corpus, increasing. Here is a slight increase. And you even find modern examples. This is from the British National Corpus. Here you would say you won't be the first or last man or woman who gets themselves, where you would probably think this is a wrong form, it should be themselves. But this is a compromise form in order to be gender neutral. So you compromise on the number. And this is what we would call change from above, where due to political demands, the language changes. And of course, you might see that in the written language much more freely and more frequently nowadays, because many journals, publishing houses, newspapers have guidelines on non-sexist writing. So how does Christian Meyer explain all this? What does he say? So again, please remember, I'm just giving you a short overview, just picked out some examples. He also looked, for example, at contractions. I don't know whether you have been told not to use contractions in a formal context, that you shouldn't use can't or won't in a written paper. And so he studied contractions in the written language, and he found that contractions are increasing. Meyer looks into this question as well, and he says that American English is, if you, for example, look at the patterns that I've shown, in many respects, in many of the examples that he investigated, more advanced than British English. But it's not quite clear whether this is a trend which has already started in, let's say, late early modern English, and just America is faster than British English, or whether American English is the precursor and then feeding it back to British English. So this is something he can't answer on the basis of his data. Because if you find a specific feature, I mean, we've all seen these features are present in both varieties. So you can't say, is British English changing because of the influence of American English, or is this a common change? It is just that America is moving faster. So this is a very, very difficult question, which you can't answer on the basis of this corpus evidence alone. So this was an example of what you can do with a corpus which is considered rather old-fashioned, or the first one of its kind, by updating it, by replicating the corpus design. And let me now turn to the so-called ICE project, which is the project very intimately related to our topic. ICE stands for International Corpus of English. And that was conceived in the 80s. The late Sidney Greenbaum wrote a proposal for an international computerized corpus of English. So that was his suggestion. And he wanted this corpus to include, first of all, standard varieties from other countries where English is the first language, for example, Canada and Australia. Of course, it should start in Britain. Should sample national varieties from countries where English is an official additional language, for example, India and Nigeria. So India was singled out already. And third, and to include spoken and manuscript English as well as printed English. So in terms of balance and representativeness, he wanted to go much further. He wanted to include spoken language, non-printed language, and he would basically want to cover the whole English-speaking world. And we have the ICE corpus manual here. We will come back to that in our practice session, but the text which has here the text categories and file names shows you the structure of all the ICE corpora. And this is, of course, a very wonderful resource because the structure, the compilation systems are replicated in, I think, more than almost 20 corpora. The whole ICE corpora, every ICE corpus has 1 million words, around 1 million words. 60% of that is spoken language, 40% is written language. And if you look at the text categories, it has, for example, in the spoken section, the difference between dialogue, monologue. It has unscripted, for example, spontaneous discussion, and scripted broadcast. So all sorts of different text types are captured in it. And it also includes, as it says here, manuscript English. For example, it includes student essays. And if you want to sample standard varieties of English, this is what is meant by standard or national varieties. This is the definition of what kind of speakers should be included in the corpus. So this is from the website. It says, the authors and speakers of the text are aged 18 or above, were educated through the medium of English, and were either born in the country in whose corpus they are included or moved there at an early age and received their education through the medium of English in the country concerned. So if you want to sample the standard of a variety, rather than defining what is the standard beforehand, you just define what kind of speakers should contribute. And this criterion is something I remarked upon that in the paper, is we're educated through the medium of English does not always work for all the countries. For example, ICE India, there's a manual for ICE India written by Professor Shastri. He said, well, ICE India was compiled in the early 90s, and not all the speakers contributed were educated through the medium of English. Many were English teachers, but not all of them were educated through the medium of English. This can't be achieved in many countries. And this is a snapshot or a screenshot from the website. We will look at some of the ICE corpora, and these are the corpora that are currently available: Canada, East Africa, Great Britain, Hong Kong, India, Ireland, Jamaica, New Zealand. Nigeria is completed now. I think it has a spoken component as well. Philippines, Singapore, Sri Lanka, so far only the written component. USA, only the written component. We will talk about why it's easier to get the written component published than the spoken component. And all of these are freely available except ISGB. For that you have to pay. You can just click on that, download it, and then you have to download a form and sign it that you only use it for scholarly purposes, and then they will send you the password to unlock the corpus. And this, you could say, more or less all, not all, but quite a substantial body of research today in postcolonial Englishes uses these corpora, and this has a specific reason. One of the reasons has been formulated by Edgar Schneider himself. So he said in his book, when we look at postcolonial Englishes, the question is, how do they develop? How different are they from other Englishes? And he said, while words fluctuate relatively easily, the grammar of a language tends to be much more stable and resistant to change. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that grammatical innovations also in the process of structural nativization, so we talked about nativization yesterday, typically start out where the regular meets the chaotic, that is, at the intersection of grammar and lexis. So regular would be the grammar, chaotic, the vocabulary. Therefore, many of the characteristic innovations of postcolonial Englishes can be located at this boundary. They concern the co-occurrence potential of certain words with other words or specific structures. So it's not terribly new what you find in postcolonial Englishes, but probably new ways of saying the same thing, new combinations, for example, of verbs and prepositions, or new what we would call collocations, new patterns. And we would also see rather small changes, quantitative changes, not all or nothing changes. Hardly anything is totally new. It's just, tendencies to use some structures more than others. And this is, of course, something you can investigate empirically on the basis of a corpus. And this is why there's a pretty happy marriage, you could say, between the International Corpus of English project and postcolonial Englishes. And what exactly this means, so we have two papers in our reader which tells us something about what is supposed to be typical of Indian English. Tomorrow we'll also talk about what can be empirically investigated with corpora, how much of what has been written about Indian English has been corroborated by corpus evidence, and this is something we are going to look at. So another corpus, and this is the only one which gives us access to further South Asian varieties. You've seen that ICE India only includes, the ICE project only includes India. We have, in terms of Asian languages, that's Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, but we don't know anything, or Bangladesh, Pakistan are not included. And so colleagues of mine, or former colleagues of mine at the University of Gießen, and the Joybrat Mukherjee, whom I mentioned yesterday, who is also included with a paper, they created the South Asian Varieties of English corpus. And this includes Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And what they did, they wrote an automatic program which could extract data from the archives of these newspapers. So you see India is represented by the Statesman and the Times of India. And they collected 3 million words from newspaper archives, online archives per variety. So what we have here is an 18 million word corpus of newspaper English distributed over 6 varieties of South Asian English. And it's, of course, much easier. It's still a lot of work, but it's much easier to get the written data from the internet rather than go out and collect spoken data. The rough estimation is that for every minute of recorded spoken data, you need an hour to put it into machine-readable form. This is one of the big reasons why spoken corpora are so hard to come by. So why newspaper language? The hypothesis is, we talked about the fact yesterday that we do not really, that Indian English is not really codified right now. We don't have a dictionary. And so the hypothesis is, in the absence of a fully codified, acknowledged standard for any of these South Asian varieties, we assume that these national level newspapers are the closest we get to the standard, because they are supra-regional, pan-Indian or pan-Bangladesh, and they read all over the place, and people who work there come probably from all over India. So this would be a kind of incipient national standard, if there ever is one. And one important feature of this is of this corpus is, well, you might say, well, half of my newspaper comes from Reuters, international news agencies anyways, and these were systematically removed. So they wrote a script that all these news agencies reports, for example, Reuters, Agence France-Presse, were automatically removed because this wouldn't be representative of Indian or Bangladesh English, but of some international kind of English. So we will have the opportunity to work with this corpus. I will also show you what has been done on the basis of this corpus so far. And it will probably take some time before anybody goes to Pakistan or the Maldives or Nepal to collect spoken data. They might not even find enough speakers. Well, not in Pakistan, I'm not worried, but in the Maldives, I don't know how many people speak English. Probably only in the tourism industry. And you have the manual of this corpus also in your reader, which will give you more detailed information. So if we now come back to our guiding questions, which would give us more time for discussion, I hope I've already hinted at some of the answers. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of including spoken language in corpora? What does balanced mean? Or what does representative mean? And then is the question, how does your research question influence your corpus design and vice versa? Some of you have already indicated a very particular interest. Then you can easily, with the help of the web, create your own corpus. As I said, you can go to Project Gutenberg and have a corpus of 19th century female writers in English. That's no problem. So how does your research question influence your corpus design and the other way around? And I would like to open up the discussion, but first I would like to take your questions.